Tales of the Forbidden City. Shadow Wars. Written by onur diler. Hunters, Wizards, and Darkmen. April 25th. Typhoon. It was about a year before the great flu epidemic that changed the world completely, and an old man named Otto von Lonsenrader was reading his newspaper. It was a spring day that was as hot as summer. The old man sitting on a bench under a cherry tree in the garden of the maternity ward of the hospital was wearing a white felt hat, a white suit and shoes that were almost 50 years old, in the fashion of the previous 50 years. His legs were crossed. His small rectangular glasses had a dark blue lens that did not fit in with the hospital garden. He looked very calm, unlike the other relatives of the patients who were lighting and extinguishing cigarettes one after another and pacing back and forth, waiting for news from inside. A cane was leaning on the bench right next to the old man. The cane was thin and had a black, silver handle, unlike the old man's clothes. Hearing a few wing beats, the old man looked up. A few pigeons had landed on the concrete area in front of him. The smiling old man reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small paper bag. He sprinkled the small grains of barley that fell from the paper bag into his hand to the birds with light movements. A few more birds came flying from the hospital entrance. A couple of pigeons that were used to people flew down and landed on the man's wrinkled hand. A few nurses coming out of the hospital smiled at the old man sitting in front of the cherry tree that had just bloomed. Then a goldfinch joined these birds. When the goldfinch arrived, the others took off in fear. The man's smile turned to sadness. The sand-colored bird, much smaller than the pigeons, just watched the man without feeding from his hand. Looking at the deep darkness in his eyes, the man brought the bird that had landed on his hand very close to his face and said, "Don't get involved in this." The bird first landed on the concrete area in front of the man, then took off and disappeared among the trees. As the beard faded, the man in the navy suit who left the hospital wiped his forehead with a handkerchief he took from his inside pocket. The thin, tall man looked like the English in the movies. His brilliantine hair was combed back. His neatly ironed suit and shoes were the latest fashion. This middle-aged man went directly to the man in the white hat and said in a monotonous tone, "The birth has taken place, sir. They are twins, their health is good." The man in the white suit looked at his wrinkled hand and said, just like the oracle said, "So, what will happen according to the prophecy, sir?" The man in white thought for a moment, narrowed his eyes, and asked, "You know about the tornadoes that happen in America, don't you?" The man nodded vaguely and said, "Yes, sir, the air currents are spinning and connecting to the ground." The smiling old man said, "That's exactly what the twins will do. They will connect the two worlds, just as a tornado connects the sky and the earth. And they will turn everything around them upside down as they do so. Everything will change except the essence of man, even religions and states will not be safe." His assistant asked curiously, "But doesn't that go against our law of balance?" The old man in white clothes said, "Maybe so, maybe not. They will be the necessary connections to open the door, think of them as hinges. Dissimilar twins, always half when apart, more than whole when brought together. Two men who share the same soul. These two men will reunite two worlds that were once separated," he said, shrugging his shoulders indifferently. The assistant raised an eyebrow. "What about the storm?" The man in white looked up at the sky above the trees and said, "It must come. The old order must be destroyed before a new order can be established. Son, what matters is what comes after the storm. With the two worlds connected, there will be such great changes in such a short time that 100 years after the storm there will be a completely different world." As if he were looking beyond the sky. His assistant raised his head as if he could see where the old man was looking and asked, "What do you order us to do?" "Nothing," the old man said, standing up and sighing. His assistant was surprised, but he hid it skillfully. Doing nothing was not this man's usual style. He would definitely meddle in things, watch, and somehow touch people's business without them realizing it. That's why his assistant, who had been working with him for a very long time, was quite surprised by the man in the navy blue suit. "But sir, what if the twins of destiny fall into the hands of the black men?" he objected. The assistant raised an eyebrow. "What about the storm?" The man in white looked up at the sky above the trees and said, "It must come. The old order must be destroyed before a new order can be established. Son, what matters is what comes after the storm. With the two worlds connected, there will be such great changes in such a short time that 100 years after the storm there will be a completely different world." As if he were looking beyond the sky. His assistant raised his head as if he could see where the old man was looking and asked, "What do you order us to do?" "Nothing," the old man said, standing up and sighing. His assistant was surprised, but he hid it skillfully. Doing nothing was not this man's usual style. He would definitely meddle in things, watch, and somehow touch people's business without them realizing it. That's why his assistant, who had been working with him for a very long time, was quite surprised by the man in the navy blue suit. "But sir, what if the twins of destiny fall into the hands of the black men?" he objected. This was the first objection of the assistant in his 20 years of service. Smiling, the old man folded the newspaper in his hand neatly, tucked it under his arm, took his cane and slowly stood up. "Fate will protect them from us. That's what the prophecy says," he said. There was a kind and compassionate expression on his face. He slowly rose from where he stood, took the arm of the man he was talking to and started to walk away from the hospital, when the old man pulled up from the parking lot to pick him up. "Start the Ferguson Foundation project. Since the storm is coming and when it starts, there will be no sight, we need guides for the rest," he added. Then, looking at the worried expression of his assistant, he said, "Don't worry about the Blackmen, Bakesfield. If we protect the twins, the Blackmen will wonder what we are protecting and find them. Then the twins will be in danger, but if we stay away, the Blackmen will stay away too. Even if they know the prophecy, they cannot read the signs that determine its time like we can. They will roam the world and look for twins who are the cause of the abnormality, and we will follow them. Remember," he said as he got into his car, "what is unknown is not threatened." About 16 years later. April 18, Russian airspace, near Moscow. Hunter. The man sleeping inside an American Airlines Airbus A400 approaching Moscow International Airport was tall, muscular, and big. Michael Richardson's broad shoulders spilled out over the seat. The dark-haired man always wore his hair, which was about 2 inches long, combed back. He wore a pair of loose-fitting, cream-colored slacks and Vibram-soled boots. He wore his classic green lens Ray-Ban sunglasses. He wore a cream-colored shirt and a khaki-green fleece jacket. His blue eyes seemed to be scanning and examining everything. The warning signs inside the plane were on. The navy blue-clad flight attendants were still trying to wake up the sleeping passengers. The fact that they all had almost identical smiles on their faces almost made Michael laugh. Michael looked at Moscow for a while, which he started to see as the plane turned to approach the runway. He hadn't been to this city for a long time. Richardson had boarded the plane with only a backpack. So he headed to the passport and customs section without waiting at the airport. A sullen-faced woman, who was as big as he was, told the customs officer that she was only here for business and then headed for the exit. Moscow airport had also had more than its share of the economic crisis that Russia was in. Some electronic signs were not working, and the area was filthy. Michael had only seen 4 police officers in the last 200 meters he walked. They all looked very tense and tired. The young man who was 5 feet tall and passed by Michael looked back after him and reached for his phone. He had a photo of Michael in his other hand. The young man, who spoke Russian, must have been 19 at most. His hair was dreadlocked down to the middle of his back. He had round sunglasses on his nose that were clearly just for decoration. His shiny, goose-down jacket and a pair of sneakers used for outdoor sports under his loose, beige trousers with side pockets completed his outfit. The young man who was waiting for him approached Michael from behind, left the key to the safe deposit box in the side pocket of his bag, and disappeared into the crowd as soon as he arrived. Michael looked at the message on his BlackBerry. The man, whose eyebrows rose at the message, searched his bag and found the key left in the side pocket. The key said 314. Michael found the locations of the lockers on the signs and found a large camping bag waiting for him in the locker he opened. Without hesitation, Michael shouldered the bag and headed towards the car rental service when the phone started ringing. Michael heard the Cardinal's velvety voice when he answered the phone. "Hello, Michael." Richardson recognized him. It was Cardinal Silvio Toscani. The Cardinal had a deep voice of his own, but a soft speaking style. "Hello, Reverend Father," Michael said calmly, cautiously, still scanning the area through his sunglasses. "Did you get your bag? You know I bought it? How many people are watching me?" Michael asked calmly, checking the window of a store he passed. "Just one," Toscani said in a cheerful, almost endearing tone. Michael stopped at a newspaper stand, picked up a New York Times, and said, with an indifferent air, "That's weird, I counted two." "Oh, how forgetful I am, of course there were two," said Toscani's voice, with an amusing and distinctly manipulative tone. Michael smiled. If the Cardinal accepted this, there must have been at least 3 people. Toscani was not one of those men who did his job halfway. Still, he did not want to press the subject. "I suppose that is not why you called me," he said, dismissing the subject. Toscani seemed relieved. "Of course, my son. There have been some changes in your mission. The enemy has changed its position and numbers," the Cardinal said solemnly. Michael cursed silently, as if he were gritting his teeth and grinning. "You don't say things you'll regret, my son?" the Cardinal asked on the other end of the phone. There was a certain amusement in his tone. "Not remarkable, my dear father," said Michael, laughing uncontrollably. "I will still pray for you tonight," Toscani said with an exaggerated air that was clearly a role play. "I'd be very happy to do that, sir," Michael said sincerely, as he looked into one of the shop windows he passed. In the reflection of the glass, he saw another man watching him. Together with the one on the balcony, the one by the telephones, and the one behind the security guards, they made 5 men. "In that case, we've made some changes. A task force from our Moscow office will pick you up. They're conducting reconnaissance now," the Cardinal said, returning to the mission briefing. Michael said in a tone that was close to rebellion, "Holy Father, the final decision is yours, of course, but our brothers in the central offices usually have little field experience, and their situation is even worse in Russia. I am afraid that even during reconnaissance, they might reveal themselves and ruin the entire operation." He had experienced enough in the past 5 years how deceptive the Cardinal's sincerity, soft voice, and politeness could be. So rather than push his luck, he volunteered to attack the enemy cell with a group of drunk and inexperienced Russians. "I'm afraid you have no choice, my boy," the Cardinal said with a sigh. "There are about 10 of them, and they're in a new place. They may have heard of us. I can't send you there alone." Toscani was right from his point of view, and Michael was just trying his luck anyway. "I understand, sir," he said in a bored tone. "Your contact's name is Olga Semengova. She'll be waiting for you in front of Avis," the Cardinal said in a monotone. Michael's face contorted as if he'd been stabbed in the kidneys. He hoped that the person the Cardinal was talking about wasn't the Olga he thought he was talking about. He even prayed to God for it. When he hung up the phone, he had an expression on his face that made him unsure whether God truly loved him. Miles south of Street Michael, in Rome, Cardinal Toscani was hanging up the phone when an old man's voice said calmly behind him, "Who are you talking to, Brother Toscani?" The Cardinal turned and smiled, bowing respectfully. "Brother Michael Richardson, Your Excellency, a hunter of the 7th rank," he said. The man with the red sash around his black robe was a dark, slender Italian. He was not a very handsome man, with high cheekbones, slightly slanted eyes, and a hooked nose. His blue eyes were always searching under his thick eyebrows. "Oh, that boy," said the man with the white hair as white as his clothes, the stooped, wrinkled face, smiling as he walked towards the large windows overlooking Rome. "Yes, my dear sir," said Cardinal Toscani, respectfully, clasping his hands behind his back. The old man standing next to the thick burgundy curtain looked out of the thick glass and asked mischievously, "Doesn't it make you nervous that I'm standing here?" "Yes, sir, the windows are armored," But I still worry about you getting hit by a heavy caliber sniper rifle, Toscani said, nodding. The old man laughed and said, Toscani, I am 93 years old, I could just as well be shot with an air gun. Then, gesturing to the cardinal with his wrinkled hands, he said, Come on, my anxious young friend, let's go out into the garden, at least there is no one there who intends to shoot the Pope. The weather in Rome was almost hot. The scattered clouds were flowing in the direction of the wind, and here and there they left a warm touch of the sun upon the city like a blessing. The inner garden they had come out of was well kept and tidy. In the garden were several priests and a nun reading books on the Bible and theology. As the people passing by stopped to greet them, the old man calmly stopped and spoke to each of them. He remembered each of their names. As the last priest walked away smiling, the old man asked, Where is Richardson now? Your Excellency, Moscow, Toscani said calmly. The old man smiled, closed his eyes, and, lost in his memories, said, Ah, Moscow. I had been there a few times when I was young. The Cold War had just ended. It was a lively place that made your blood boil. Have you ever been there, Toscani? He asked cheerfully. A few times, Your Excellency, but it wasn't that much fun, Toscani said in a gentle tone. The old man opened his eyes, squinted, and looked at the cardinal next to him with another mischievous smile, and asked, Did you leave after putting on your robe? Toscani understood what the old man was getting at. He smiled back and said, Yes, Your Excellency. The old man put his hand on the cardinal's shoulder and patted him in a fatherly way. That's why, son. You're no fun, but you're always honest, and that's one thing I admire about you. Richardson, has that boy finished his service in Germany? He asked. Toscani nodded affirmatively, Yes, Your Excellency. He found and destroyed 2 enemy cells. When the tracks he found there led to Moscow, Richardson headed there too. The old man pursed his lips and nodded in appreciation. He's a really good hunter. It's a shame he can't use magic. Toscani agreed, but he always thought Michael was more skilled than he seemed. The man might have learned magic and was hiding it. But if he was able to hide it, that was a great skill. Still, he makes up for this deficiency with his skills, sir, he said, appreciating the hunter himself. Ah yes. That's for sure, said the old man. And have you heard of the twins found in Africa? Toscani shook his head. Yes sir, they are not the twins we are looking for. The old man clicked his jaw and said, That's too bad, Toscani. Our time is running out. If the twins of fate open or use the gate of Tomender, the magic will start flowing again, and even in our current state, we will lose the war. Toscani asked, another possibility coming to his mind, what if they don't open it? The prophecy was very vague on this subject, and even though many comments had been made about it, many opinions had been expressed, many meetings had been held, it was still vague. And Toscani did not like vagueness. That's even worse, my boy, the old man said, shaking his head. Now we at least have a goal. If we find the twins, we can send all our lone wolves of the Michael Richardson level to them to prevent disaster. However, if someone else can open the gate, we may not be able to handle it. Toscani just nodded. Despite his age, the Pope was a man whose sharp mind could be trusted. He was a former inquisitor and, more importantly, a good hunter. He had reached the 9th level before he put on his robe and returned to the church. Hunters normally worked in groups of 4. Their numbers would decrease as their levels and proficiency increased. Hunters beyond the 6th level worked alone. They were called lone wolves. The Pope was a legend among the lone wolves. He silently prayed for Michael, if only for a short while. Michael prayed for a short moment. Olga Semengova was a woman of 6 feet, with a body and face that would make even models jealous. The woman, who was in her late 20s, had blonde hair so light it could easily be mistaken for silver. The beautiful woman wore black, shiny leggings and riding boots. She had on a black shirt and a short black jacket. She wore very little makeup, which highlighted her ice blue eyes. When she saw Michael, the woman smiled with her full lips, extended her thin-wristed, well-groomed hand, and said with great sincerity, "Hello, Richardson." This made Michael even more nervous. "Hello, Semengova," he said, swallowing. "It's nice to see you again," the woman said with a voice that could melt a man and a smile that would not be forgotten easily. None of those who had been close enough to him to be smitten by his charm were now alive. Olga Semengova had been one of the best assassins in the SVR before she left. Semengova, known as the Ice Sparrow, had become so good at it over time that she had left the SVR, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, with a clear conscience. Michael couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. "Really?" he asked. Their last meeting with Olga was quite inappropriate for this kind of smile or intimacy. She shrugged and asked, "Of course, we are now practically sisters, aren't we?" Michael noted the tension in the woman's full lips at the sister part, painfully. 6 years ago, Olga and her team had been set up by Michael and his team in Rome. They had stolen the double agent they had captured. If Michael knew Olga well enough, the young woman was sure that Michael would kill her for this, by trying to kill her with a teaspoon for hours. The only question in this case was how loyal Olga was to the sisterhood. Michael realized there was no point in worrying about it. The damage had been done, he was now in Olga's dump and the woman had no teaspoon in her hand. "What are we doing, Sister Semengova?" he asked, his usual carefree manner. Smiling, Olga waved Michael toward the exit. "Our reconnaissance team is watching the building where our enemy is hiding. I have set up an operations center nearby. We will go there, and 2 12-person assault teams will attack the target building. We will just watch in our operations center." Michael didn't like this "we'll just watch" part either. There was nothing to do anyway. This woman was the person in charge of operations in Moscow. Disobedience to her would cause big problems, so he calmly watched Olga. By the time they reached an industrial district in the north of Moscow, almost 2 hours had passed. Moscow traffic was as congested as ever and almost demanding of patience. The states that made up the Russian Federation had been separated by an economic crisis 5 years ago. It had been a dramatic and violent divorce, and the wars that had broken out had lasted almost 3 years. The crisis had changed many things in Russia. While many companies that were considered solid had declared bankruptcy, there had been an incredible corruption in the state structure, and the quality of life had suddenly dropped below average. However, like many other companies that had seized the crisis as an opportunity, Nisco Oil, secretly supported by the Vatican, had seized many key positions with its investments. Nisco Oil was a company that was not visible, but was a major shareholder of many oil giants. This company had many subordinate and covert working groups. While Nisco Oil was looking after oil and petroleum products, Neexgan Armory was taking on weapons production and development. With the agreements they made with the American Army this year, they were going to modernize a large part of the Army. However, these were not the only areas they were interested in. In the health sector, they had thousands of hospitals or polyclinics in the world as Blue Medical Group. In the transportation sector, there was Airnex, which had bought American Airlines last year, and in the energy sector, there was Enernex. Although these were not leading companies, they were strong competitors that made leaders look back with concern. Lifeguarding Group was the company Michael officially worked for. He worked as a consultant here. The group, which had entered the finance sector about 3 years ago, had bought many global banks and established bankex. According to the rumors Michael had heard, their new goal was to create new stock exchanges. In the communications sector, there was Telnex, and in the construction sector, there was Worknex. As Michael watched the misery outside, he thought about the company's enormous wealth. The damned priests were trying to destroy the sorcerers and were taking over the world. In the ages when history was told in stories and songs, the Darkmen were the first to resist the wizards when they tried to enslave the world. The wizards punished them so harshly that the survivors had to hide. Over time, this secrecy became a habit and a discipline. In the Middle Ages, the Knights of Malta suggested that they grow stronger and create their own funds through trade. For this, the Darkmen, who first transported goods by ship, joined forces with the Roman Catholic Church after Friday the 13th. There was no right or wrong for them. Anyone who was hostile to the wizards was probably an ally of the Darkmen. But they were not third-class scoundrels either. The Darkmen hid the survivors of the knights who were executed by the Roman Catholic Church for their wealth. The Darkmen, who learned many things from them, found a new partner in the New Age when the Vatican lost power in the world in the future: money. The Darkmen were the first to establish Nisco oil. They had the perfect resources and power for the Vatican to form a new Inquisition. They had already taken control of many small countries. Many politicians were easily bought with money, while others were gently moved out of the way. Most of the politicians who were bought were running their countries as Nisco oil wanted, without even knowing who their owners were. However, some things could not be prevented. For example, the economic crisis that hit Russia. Despite their best efforts, Nisco and the other companies under its umbrella could not prevent Russia's rapid collapse. They had only slowed the decline by purchasing strategic locations. Michael noticed that Moscow, which was in crisis, had not changed much. Most of the population still looked miserable. The buildings and roads were in disrepair. He sighed and turned his attention to the inside of the car. There were 2 bodyguards in suits at the front of the armored Audi they were in. Michael, who could tell from the bulges in their suits that they were armed to the teeth and wearing bulletproof vests, had listened to Olga's phone conversations along the way. The young woman, who hung up her phone in annoyance, asked, "How is your Russian?" "It really sucks," Michael said in terrible Russian. "It really is awful," the young woman said, raising her eyebrows and whistling in a high-pitched tone. Michael looked at Olga as if to say, "I told you so," and changed the subject. "What have you been up to so far?" he asked. Said, "Not much," and added, "The elements I sent for reconnaissance determined the location and number of the enemy. They are on the 6th floor of an apartment building. We arranged an apartment floor in the same block and moved there as a company. In this way, I arranged a place for my teams that would advance from the roof and attack from the windows and doors, and it was also silent from the helicopter." Michael found the woman's tone interesting. She didn't seem to care much, but she seemed proud of the strategy she was explaining so matter-of-factly. "Monitoring?" the man asked, thinking this part was a major weakness. "The company will transfer its satellites to us in a few hours, and in the meantime we have a drone," the young woman said, pointing into the air with her index finger. Michael nodded appreciatively and asked, "What is it?" Smiling slightly, the woman said, "A Polyak 210. Polyaks were newly produced unmanned aerial vehicles. The polycarbonate-bodied vehicles had 2 propeller engines and were capable of vertical takeoff and landing. The Polyak 210, which had surveillance and attack features, also had silent flight. With an 8-hour continuous flight time, it was perfect for this task. Of course, these UAVs were as big as normal pest control aircraft. They had to have permission from the government to fly like this. But that was the easy part. Governments controlled governments, and all governments were made up of elected businessmen. Businessmen had always been greedy. A company could do whatever it wanted in a country by buying a few ministers, and it was all about how corrupt the country was. "Well, there's nothing better," Michael said, his lips curling in appreciation. Then he looked around and asked, "How much farther?" 5 minutes, Olga said with a smile, then looked at Michael and said, "You used to be more patient." "We used to just mess with each other," Michael shrugged. "No wizards or anything else involved," he added. "Oh, you take them too seriously. I don't think they could light their own cigarettes without help," Olga said with an overconfident expression, waving her hand in a very nonchalant manner. In truth, Michael had seen sorcerers who could light much more than a cigarette. Still, there was one of the usual pointless arguments on the horizon, and he had not come here to argue with Olga. "How many people are gathered?" he asked, focusing on the task again. 11, Olga said, smiling. Michael hadn't expected this. He raised an eyebrow and grumbled, "Isn't that a bit crowded? There's probably been at least 3 of them together so far." Olga smiled and shrugged again. "Maybe they're having a general meeting or something," she joked. But Michael didn't laugh at the joke. He didn't like the idea either. He was a former SEAL commando. Although their English name was Navy SEALs, the name SEAL originally meant sea, air, and land. It was an acronym indicating the areas in which this unit had operational capacity, and many officers and petty officers in the Navy would give their right arm to be a member of this unit. The roots of the SEALs date back to 1943. Their main purpose was to go to the area before the landings and clear the area, making operations easier. After the end of World War II, these teams, which were organized as a special assault unit in 1947, began to be known as underwater explosive teams. In the 1960s, with the order of the President of the United States John F. Kennedy, each branch of the military formed its own special teams, while the Navy also formed the SEALs. The training of SEAL commandos, who were a shining star among the elite units, was long and exhausting. There were many who left the training, which was voluntarily attended by Navy infantry, petty officers and officers. However, those who completed it were included in the Navy's fighting force operating all over the world, and with the badge they carried, they left many officers and petty officers behind in reputation. Michael was a well-known name among the SEALs, and for this to happen, it was necessary to survive. Michael survived because he took his job seriously. Michael had one day gone to Rome with an incredible offer from the Vatican and joined the Vatican's new Inquisition. He was a hunter, a member of the Black Men, a brotherhood created by the Vatican to hunt down sorcerers. Hunters were operators trained to hunt sorcerers. Michael Richardson was a hunter of the 7th level in this highly skilled warrior group, most of whom were solitary, hermits. There were not many people of his level. One of the advantages of his level and skill was that he could work alone. He had hunted many sorcerers in many places so far. However, he had never seen more than 3 of them gathered together. However, despite all his experience and high self-confidence, he did not want to face an advanced sorcerer. Sorcerers had their own universal laws and could be quite formidable opponents when cornered. That was why the idea of the meeting Olga had mentioned had caused small cramps in Michael's stomach. The Audi slowed down noticeably in one of the suburbs of Moscow and then slowly turned into a side street shortly after. When they entered a street with old cars and children running around playing with toys in their hands, Olga looked at the street and said, "This is it." It was an old residential area with blocks of 6 or 7-story concrete apartment buildings. The monotonous, old, neglected buildings, once built by the government, were in a miserable state. Laundry hanging on the balconies of many of them reminded Michael that these apartments were occupied by civilians. The pavements in front of the apartments were littered with garbage. Although there was almost no parking space, all the cars were in a state of decay. As the Audi pulled up, Michael thought that even if nothing happened, the men would take one look out the window and notice it themselves because of the car. Olga smiled as if she understood. "Our target is 1 block back," she said. While Michael was looking around and memorizing his location, Olga teased him by saying, "Oh, and Michael, I'm afraid I forgot to bring you a gun and bulletproof vest." Michael just smiled back. He didn't like her cheerful and careless attitude at all. The truth behind Olga's cute joke was that she was planning to keep Michael in the operations center. Michael just hoped things wouldn't come to that. The apartment they entered was 7 stories high. The facade of the old building was peeling off in places, the walls were cracked. The building looked like it was about to collapse due to neglect. They passed by the broken elevators and climbed the stairs with dynamic but slow steps. Some floors had no lights, some were dimmed occasionally, sometimes blinking, some floors were hearing the sound of matches, and some were hearing coughs, the first signs of irregular nutrition and unhealthy conditions. Michael, following Olga, caught the familiar smell of dampness and mold. A woman in a plastic bag and a long old brown coat passed them. The woman in her 60s had tied her head with a scarf. Her dull blue eyes did not turn to Olga or Michael. Michael glanced back briefly at the woman who had emerged from the apartment as if she were a ghost. The operations center was on the 7th floor of the same block as the apartment where the so-called enemy sorcerers lived. The house chosen was quite spacious, but just like the exterior of the building, it was neglected and worn. The slogans of the popular uprising that had spread to almost all of Moscow 5 years ago were still on the walls. The walls that had once formed the house had been torn down, and the kitchen and bedrooms had been combined. Inside what was probably a studio, a 12-man assault team was preparing. 3 of the men had climbing equipment so they could rappel from the roof and enter through the windows. 3 large tables had been brought into the room, one of which was propped up against the wall. The main transmitter and monitoring screens that linked the soldiers' radios were on this table. At the table stood a tall, thin, stooped young operator with horn-rimmed glasses and brown hair. Michael assumed he was 19 at most. The shaggy-haired man had energy drink cans on his right and a radio on his left. On the second table were weapons maintenance equipment, small caliber weapons, and Kevlar vests. The third table was empty, with first aid equipment and serums piled on the chair next to it. It would be used as a first aid area for those injured in this operation. Behind the table, along the wall, were food and drinks for the team. At the other end of the room were working generators and sleeping bags. Power for the computer units came from here. The men in the attic were hired guns for the lifeguarding group, a subsidiary of Nisko Oil. Most of them were mercenaries from the Spetsnaz, or Russian Special Forces. They were armed with the latest generation AK-74A2. The AK-74A2S used 5.56mm ammunition. Michael saw that the bottoms of the magazines and the weapons were marked red. He knew that meant explosive rounds. No matter how the operation ended, it was going to be very noisy. "How do you explain all that noise?" Michael asked, nodding toward the guns. Olga shrugged. "The police already know. Last year, the city government took over the 6 districts of the lifeguard group to ensure Moscow's security. We have the same authority as the police," she said. The soldiers with the LGG emblem wore Kevlar helmets, high-necked bulletproof vests, and shoulder armor. They were fully equipped with 9mm Beretta 92 FS and leg holsters. As it got darker, they began to attach night vision units to their helmets. A few tiny ringing sounds came from the soldiers turning these units on and off. Michael followed Olga to the tables in the corner of the hall. There were 3 separate televisions on the tables. The first television was showing thermal images from the drone circling over my block. The second screen was showing footage from snipers across the street. They were also filming with thermal cameras. As Michael approached and examined the red and orange bodies on the screen, the operator at the screen said excitedly, "The thermal images are coming from behind a wall, so they look like ghosts." When Michael looked at him, the operator smiled and said, "Milovich Polenvov," and extended his hand. Michael shook the outstretched hand and said, "Michael." Michael was a legend among LGG operators, so Milovich opened his mouth, eyebrows raised in surprise, when Michael pointed to the small red dot on the screen and asked, "What's that?" "A cat," said Milovich, adjusting his glasses. "A cat?" Michael asked, scratching his chin. "Yes." Michael put his backpack down. Meanwhile, Olga looked at her watch and nodded to the leader of the roof team who was waiting for her signal in the room. The leader nodded to Olga. Then he made the sign of the cross and gave the team a ready signal. While the group went up to the roof of the building, Olga looked for the team that would enter the apartment from the street door. The assault team, which came in an old laundry van, stopped in front of the apartment building with a loud brake sound. The team in 2 rows that came out from behind the suddenly opened doors quickly headed for the stairs, leaving 2 people at the door. The assault team on the roof had meanwhile taken up position. The rope team was suspended only 5 feet above the window. The assault team, who had taken up positions at 2 separate doors, had taken up positions in the corridor. Under the protection of 2 of his comrades, an operator silently sprayed the door with a spray-on type of white, shaving foam compound that solidified as it was sprayed. When he had finished the perimeter of the door, he attached a small detonator to the bottom corner. This compound would blow the door open. When Olga gave the command to both teams to advance, the 4-man assault team, which had tied its ropes to the edge of the roof, began to slide down. Michael was watching the action from the drones and the gunners' cameras. But after a few seconds, his eyes locked onto the room where the enemy was. He stared at the room as if hypnotized. He hadn't yet figured out what was bothering him. But the 10 people inside and the cat were bothering him. Michael's eyes caught the cat's movements for a moment and he realized what was bothering him. When the groups reached the door, Olga was about to give the command to advance again, but Michael cursed more like a sailor than a church official and said, "This is a trap." "What?" Olga asked curiously. "This is a goddamn trap," Michael said, pointing to the cat on the screen. Olga laughed at the speck sitting on the chair Michael indicated, saying, "There's no such thing as a stupid trap, we caught them," and then pressed the button on the radio and said, "All groups forward." As Michael gnashed his teeth in anger, the explosives attached to the doors were detonated, and as the door fell inward, the pioneers at the two doors threw shock bombs inside. The shock bombs created an instant sound and light effect, momentarily paralyzing the attacker's sense of sight and hearing. After two successive explosions, the first shock team burst into the windows. They immediately entered the two doors and shot themselves in the head as they were trained to do. The only thing that died in the room was the unfortunate cat. There was no change in the people who were shot. While the attack commander Ivan Dredna was looking at the images floating in the air, saying, "Sons of bitches," the image of the drone disappeared from the televisions in the command room. As Milovic opened the UAV's control panel to see what was wrong, the images of the gunners also disappeared from the screen. Immediately afterwards, the building shook and a huge explosion was heard. While Olga was in great shock, "We're trapped." Screams and calls for help began to fill the radios. While some of the men were screaming in agony, others were begging for mercy. Olga looked at Michael in alarm, but the man was not with her. Michael had already started. He had a backpack in his hand. He opened the zipper with a sharp movement. The inside of the bag was designed as a Kevlar assault vest. This system, called Pack 2 Combat, was turned upside down and worn from head to chest, becoming a protective vest. This vest, in which everything you would need in a combat area was carefully placed, had a Glock on its chest and an EDN on its back. The EDN was a folded assault rifle. This weapon was designed for LGG operators. There were three types. The firing systems and feed ports varied according to the countries using AK-47, M4 or 7.65. For Michael, it was a system with an AK-47 magazine port and using 5.56 mm. Michael took the EDN from his back, put the folded weapon together and inserted the magazine he pulled from the log compartment on his chest and cocked the weapon. He put the intercom system he took from the table on his ear and said to Olga, "Request backup." The young woman, staring blankly at him with her walkie-talkie in her hand, muttered, "No backup." Michael didn't understand. He paused for a moment, frowning. "What?" he asked. Olga shook her head slightly. "Support." That was all we had. Michael cursed and ran down the stairs. When he left the apartment, people were coming out of the apartment across from him. Gritting his teeth, Michael looked around, but he had no other choice. He bumped into many people and went up to the attic. Smoke was rising from where the operation was being carried out 3 buildings away. Michael quickly ran to the next building and the next. Its door was bent outwards by the force of the explosion and was unhinged. The metal door was lying on the ground. Michael, who passed the metal door, leaned his EDN on his shoulder, hunched over and started to walk with his knees bent. He could hear the screams and shouts in Russian coming from downstairs. His trained ears caught the occasional clicks of the silencers. The electrical system inside the building had collapsed, only the flames illuminated the interior. The dust and smoke from the explosion made it difficult to breathe. Michael put his hand behind his waist, put on a mask to cover his mouth and nose. The filters on the side hissed when the mask was activated. Michael took a few steps forward and concentrated, his pupils glowing with a golden light as he concentrated. The darkness or soot would no longer affect him, he would be able to see his surroundings clearly. The building was old and the paint had peeled off long ago due to humidity. Due to the explosion, all the LEDs that illuminated the apartment were flickering and giving off a flickering and unreliable light, just like the fluorescents used in the past. When Michael reached the corner, he knelt down under the rising smoke, still unaffected by the smoke, and continued to hide in the corner, looking down the corridor with only his left eye sticking out. The corridor was approximately 20 meters long and 3 meters wide. The rest of the assault team took up the entire corridor. He saw 2 people standing. Both were wearing running shoes and denim pants. One had a fleece sweatshirt on his back, the other a leather jacket. Both were carrying mini Uzis, a popular Israeli weapon. They had been produced since the 1950s. The submachine gun, which was slightly larger than a pistol and could be carried and used with one hand, was revolutionary for this type of weapon and had been used for years. The Mini Uzi was designed in the early 1980s and production began by the end of the year. The Mini Uzis worked despite being filled with water and sand. Michael had seen a window opened in the wall during training with these weapons. Now, 2 men in the corridor were using this weapon to kill the wounded members of the assault team lying on the ground. Michael knew that if he acted quickly, he could save a few of his men. Still, the experienced soldier did not rush, but brought his weapon back to his shoulder and took aim. He had a stun grenade in his left hand. Then he quickly leaned to the left and fired 3 short bursts at both of his targets. His first target, the man in the leather jacket, had just shot another soldier on the ground, but he was knocked backwards by 3 5.56 caliber bullets that hit his head in quick succession. The bullets that went to the other man bounced off a blue energy shield and hit the wall on the left just before they reached him. Cursing his luck, Michael started firing again. The shields of the wizards could only protect them to a certain extent. Eventually, just like bulletproof vests, when they continued to attack the same place, their shields would break and shatter. Of course, this also depended on the wizard's level. A master wizard could even stop tank ammunition. He quickly pulled the pin of the stun grenade in his left hand and threw it at the man's head. He hoped that the bullets that kept hitting his shield would distract him long enough. Most wizards did not engage in combat that would test the protective power of their shields. Their spells did not always have the same power or the same results. So such tests carried great risks. That was all Michael could count on. However, the man held his Mini Uzi with both hands, just like Michael, and began firing. However, Michael had fired at him continuously, causing his bullets to create light ripples in the protective shield. This prevented his opponent from seeing him clearly. Michael watched as the stun grenade he had thrown between 2 or 3 bullets that had grazed him reached the man, then knelt down and turned his back. After a moment of light, a sound loud enough to stab his eardrums, and a shockwave that slapped his body, he turned again and continued firing. At this point, he started walking forward. He planned to get close enough to his opponent to fight him hand to hand if his weapons did not work. His opponent had his hands pressed against his eyes. The man's concentration was broken, and the spell should have been gone. But the blue field remained. But Michael saw the color change on his shield, and the clear, electric blue cracks. The shield was doomed. When his 30-round magazine was empty, he dropped the weapon into his belt, drew his 9mm Glock from his chest holster, cocked it, and began firing in one motion. The first bullet hit the wizard in the right shoulder, spinning him clockwise. The next ones hit his left lung and head, while Michael saw more wizards emerge down the hallway. Eyes narrowed, Michael cursed as the first of the 3 men appeared in the corner and pointed a hand at him, throwing his shoulder into the door of the house next to him. The old door, already bubbling from the pressure and heat, cracked and shattered. As he fell inside, Michael saw a bright blue bolt of lightning crackle down the length of the hallway. "I really hate wizards," he thought. The house he had fallen into was covered in dust. The windows had been blown out by the explosion. Old furniture was lost in the pastel dust and the gathering darkness. Michael quickly rolled back to his feet and loaded the full magazines into his gun and then his rifle and cocked the guns. He knew he would die if he waited there, so he quickly ran to the windows behind him. The footsteps behind him told him that his hunters were after him. Michael quickly jumped from the window as if he were jumping from a garden wall and grabbed the ledge on the floor below. But the ledge would not accept the weight of the 120-pound man and shattered. Michael grunted and grabbed the next ledge and quickly pulled himself up. Then, as the rain of bullets tore the ledge apart, Michael tripped over a coffee table in front of him and fell to the ground. The man, who turned his clumsiness into a somersault with agility, was thrown out through the open street door in front of him. The homeowners must have left the house after the explosion. Michael turned left from the door he had come out of and headed for the stairs. The man who knelt down and took cover in the corner that reached the stairs waited with his rifle for those who would come after him. But he could not hear the sounds he expected. They should have come long ago. At least they had to go downstairs to escape. No, they are not, he thought. The buildings were adjacent to each other for blocks. All they had to do was move to one of the buildings next door to hide their weapons. Damn! He growled as he headed for the stairs. He was as flexible as a cat, as silent as a ghost. When he got upstairs, Olga's voice echoed over the radio, "Michael?" The big man with blue eyes had reached the beginning of the corridor. He checked the corridor by hiding in the corner. When he saw that it was empty, he replied to Olga, "I am alive," and headed upstairs. "I'm coming there," said the young woman. "No, I need you there," Michael said firmly, then asked, "Is the satellite up yet?" "He's got a few minutes," Olga said. Then she asked, pausing, "Assault team?" Michael assessed the situation professionally. "Maximum damage," he said, and returned to the corner he had first fired at. He checked the corridor again from the corner. At the end of the long corridor was a large hole that had not been there before. He had seen the circular hole, 2 meters in diameter, before. The sorcerers used it to escape, turning the wall into sand by drawing a transmutation circle. On either side of the hole were piles of fine sand. "The enemy is breaking through the wall and advancing east. I am following," he said. Michael hunched over again and began to advance in his aiming formation. He tried not to step on the bodies lying in the corridor. He noticed that some were groaning, while others were still able to move. When he was halfway down the corridor, he heard the sound of a helicopter. At the same moment he heard Olga's voice. "The company is sending its sorcerers," the woman said in a dissatisfied voice. Michael grumbled as he searched the bodies of the 2 wizards he had killed by hand. "Great, more problems." Then he said to Olga, "The landing site is not secure, stay away." In the meantime, he had found a cell phone in the pocket of the man he had killed. He put it in his pocket and headed towards the hole. But he knew he was too late. He had already missed his prey, but he knew that this was no ordinary incompetence. Wizards had never been heard of setting a trap for the black men since the beginning of the Middle Ages. This was the first time this had happened. April 18, north of England. Puppet Master. Otto von Lonsenrader was sitting at a table set up next to his car, sipping his half-full glass of iced lemonade with mint leaves and looking at his tablet. His tablet was connected to a telescope a short distance ahead. The telescope was turned to the top of the forest opposite Otto, and as Otto's old, wrinkled fingers moved over the tablet, the telescope made millimeter movements, its lens whirring back and forth. A group of young men were having a paintball fight on the man's tablet. At that moment, the luxury SUV that had climbed the barren hill stopped 20 meters from the table, and 2 guards and a short brunette woman got out of the car. Isabella Rossefia, wanted by Interpol under the name Maria Forenzia, walked towards him, a short, beautiful Spanish woman, wearing a pencil skirt that fit her body perfectly, high heels and a stylish jacket. She sat down next to Otto and looked at the tablet for a while. She knew that 2 of the kids who had crashed were under Otto's supervision. Sean and Ian Hopestein. Otto was preparing something. Isabella, who had once worked for the Mexican Mafia, had taken over all the accounts and phones of these 2 guys. "I've done what you wanted. The Hopesteins will be on the record but they won't raise any warning signs. They will be in plain sight but no one will see them." As the Otto brothers won another match with a clean sweep, he placed one of the crystal glasses in front of Isabella and said, "They don't know them because they can't see them, and what is unknown is not threatened." With a wink. "Why are we trying so hard? Are the kids important?" Isabella asked. Otto had changed the ads and sharing streams on their social media accounts and had the 2 brothers participate in airsoft and paintball competitions. With some good guidance, the 2 brothers had done quite well in this regard, and they thought it was all their own choice. As the old man watched the young men who had won the match descend from the hills, he said with a smile, "Right now? No. They are not important. In the future? Unbelievable." Isabella just sipped her lemonade nervously. Otto never told his plans, but he would start those plans years in advance. Isabella had been the victim of one of them, and she had seen how they work like clockwork. She couldn't help but feel sorry for those children. Gail Portman and her partner Catherine Wilspel sat in a parked car at the end of the hilly road. Tall, broad, blonde Gail magnified the satellite images on her tablet and muttered, We must be either crazy or retarded to be following Otto von Lonsenrader. The woman next to her was tall and model beautiful, and she tucked her red hair behind her ear and muttered, helpless. Sir? We are pathetically helpless, he said. Otto von Lonsenrader was a retired executive of the Black Men. Von Lonsenrader had been the one who had run many of the advanced intelligence units, and had made many of the deals that had helped the Black Men rise. Now someone up there was watching him, demanding reports of his movements. Gail was an expert operator, but she had some bad habits. She was about to be kicked out of the agency because of that. Catherine was a rookie. She had also joined the agency because of her idiot brother Barney. The agency that had brought them here had probably sent them away because they thought they were both expendable. Catherine fired up her laptop to listen to the recording from the long-range listening device again. They had recorded the conversation Otto von Lonsenrader had had in a park a week ago. The man she had spoken to was Major Gerard Dumar. The middle-aged man was an officer assigned to NATO in London. According to the records, his wife had died in a car accident 2 years ago, and the Major had decided that London, where he had been to before, would be a good place to raise children. Gerard was also a well-known Far Eastern martial arts master in Europe. That's why he sold his properties in France and bought this 3-story house in London, where he lived, and prepared the entire lower floor of his house for martial arts. Catherine tapped the play button to listen to the recording again. Von Lonsenrader's voice said, "How are you, Dumar?" They sat side by side on the park bench, looking out at the pond and trees across from them. "Not bad, you? As old as history? I hope it's not a bad thing." "It depends on how much you love rheumatism." "Okay, it's something I won't worry about." "How are the kids?" "They're stupid, they're moral, they're tough. They're slow learners, but they're so stubborn that they learn." "Are they ready?" Lonsenrader said. "To what?" said Dumar. "You know I can't say that." Catherine clenched her fist. Major Gerard Dumar said hesitantly, "If they had lived in the Middle Ages, they would have been warriors whose names you have memorized, but you know the life in the battlefields." "So they are ready," said Otto mysteriously. "I can teach them many more things, but even now they are better than most of your men," said Major Gerard Dumar more firmly. Catherine stopped recording the conversation. "Why do you keep listening to this?" said his partner, Gail. "Are they preparing?" Catherine murmured, looking out the car window at the hills. "Otto von Lonsenrader is a retired Blackman leader. Even so, his wealth is incalculable. $1 billion man is preparing someone. Gail, this is very important. And when it is so important, they put us in charge. Because if he shows up, it wouldn't be hard to kill us," Catherine said. Gail looked at him and nodded. "Yeah, no one will look for us," she said. Catherine wanted to scream, to cry, to run away, to go somewhere, to hide in a remote cave. But you couldn't run away or hide from the Black Men like that. "So what do we do?" Gail tilted her head. "Have you ever heard of the concept of playing dumb?" "How?" "The order sent us after a giant, and if we uncover his actions, that giant will crush us like bugs. If we reveal ourselves and don't fall into Otto's hands, the order will crush us like bugs. If what we find is important, both of them." "He'll crush us like bugs," Catherine said. When Gail threw up her arms helplessly, "So what do we do?" "We will act like fools and delete what we find. We will not find it. Today Otto von Lonsenrader was having a picnic, for example," Gail said as she turned the ignition. "Whatever he's getting ready for, it's not as important as my life anyway." September 20th, Moscow, Russia. Dmitry Badarov. Michael Richardson was in a small room, with a lot of computer equipment in steel cabinets fixed to the walls. Michael watched the short, chubby man with a long goatee and a big nose, lost in the gray smoke of cigarette smoke. His short fingers ran over his keyboard as if they were made for this job. The bald man with the middle part of his hair falling out chuckled as green text began to flow on the dark screen in front of him. He was wearing jeans, an old cardigan, and a Star Wars t-shirt. "Long time no see, my friend Michael," he said, grinning with an unfiltered Russian cigarette clenched between his yellow teeth. That was the name Michael had introduced himself to Dmitry Bondarev when he had last come. "Yes," Michael said, "it's been a long time." His Russian was perfect, unlike the one he spoke to Olga now. "Did you find anything?" he asked. He left Olga and her team immediately after returning to the operations room, saying he would follow the trail, and went to the city center before the sorcerers arrived. "Yes, it's well encrypted, but I found it." "There's talk of a meeting," Dmitry said, shaking his head slightly from side to side, trying to summarize what he had seen. "Where?" he asked. "Next week, in Edinburgh, and they keep talking about something called the New Age, but the rest is just a bunch of meaningless sentences," said Dmitry, scratching his head. "Can you email me the texts?" Michael asked, frowning. "Of course, boss," Dmitry said with a smile. Michael reached into his pocket, tossed Dmitry a rolled-up $100 bill, and said, "Destroy the phone." Then he picked up Dmitry's phone from the table and said, "You're going to need a new phone." Dmitry smiled, tossing the scroll in his hand into the air, and said, "Don't worry." On the way to Moscow airport, Michael watched the streets from the back of a taxi and dialed the number he had memorized from Dmitry's phone. The phone rang for a while before being picked up, and when the familiar voice said, "Yes?" Michael said in a calm but loud voice, "Good evening, Excellency, I hope I'm not disturbing you." In response, the old man said, "Is that you, Michael, my child?" "Yes, sir," Michael replied to the Pope. "Cardinal Toscani told me you were in Moscow," the old man said of their conversation at noon. "I am in Moscow, Your Excellency," Michael said in a flat tone. "And the operation went badly," the old man guessed. Only then would Michael call him directly. Only the two of them knew about their connection. "Yes, sir," said Michael again. "And you doubted it?" "Yes, sir," said Michael again. "Wizards do not attack us, they run away when they see us. If they dare to attack, they have either become stronger or they are hiding something bigger," said the old man. "Yes, Your Excellency?" The old man said in a soft but serious tone, "I'll assign Toscani to the matter. He will investigate the matter immediately. I will warn Borborani to follow him. In the meantime, you have found a new trail, haven't you?" "Yes, sir," Michael said, not believing that Olga's ineptitude in the operation was accidental. "Where are you going?" the old man asked from the other end of the phone. "To Edinburgh, sir," Michael said directly. "Good, don't give up on the trail," the old man said, with a distinct note of satisfaction in his voice. "Yes," Michael said before hanging up. September 21st, London, England, Hunters. 10 hours later. The immigrant neighborhoods on the outskirts of London had a very different structure from the center. The irregular settlement and construction were immediately noticeable. However, after 10 at night, everyone would retreat to their homes and fall into great silence. In the middle of the night, the usual silence on the chaotic and disorderly streets was interrupted by a painful sound of brakes. A black Volkswagen Golf GTI, illuminated by the orange light of the street lamps, turned down the narrow street with a sound as if its engine was about to crack. The right side of the black car was completely peeled off, its rear window was burst, and its left rear fender was torn apart. The Golf's headlights were out. The Golf continued on its way as it hit and exploded the pile of garbage piled up in the narrow street. The blonde woman sitting in the right seat involuntarily flinched when the garbage bags hit the window. Her short, blunt hair was cut asymmetrically. She was a beautiful woman with sharp facial features, narrow, full lips, and large eyes in proportion to her small nose. She must have been 25 at most. Her large, almost navy blue eyes were wide with fear and darkness. She had her seat belt on. Still, she leaned her thin-wristed, delicate-fingered hand on the glove compartment to avoid being thrown and hitting something in the stopped car. "Did we get past them?" she asked. The tension in her voice was palpable. She looked around but couldn't see anything. The young and handsome man driving the car had combed his forefinger-long hair to the side. The man in the white shirt and jeans looked in the rearview mirror with the girl's question. When he saw the Mercedes car turning sharply from the corner they were turning at that moment, he grumbled, "No." When two holes opened in the windshield with a few whirs, the girl shrieked in her seat. The driver swerved, pulled the handbrake and turned the steering wheel hard. The Golf swerved, turned hard to the right and dived into a side street, and 6 large-caliber bullets opened holes in the corner on the road. Muffled explosions immediately occurred in the holes that opened, and the corner of the wall shattered. The silenced weapon used internal detonation ammunition. The man, who hissed and cursed through clenched teeth, turned his steering wheel again when he saw the white headlights in his mirror again. The place they came out was a street. Referring to the big lights illuminating the street, he shouted, "Put those out." The woman, who was huddled in her seat with fear, reached out her hand and said, "Niahalai nunkasatnatsam." The lights on the entire street flashed, and the windows of all the cars burst outward. All the lights on the street began to burn more intensely. "I told you to turn off the damn lights," the driver roared angrily. As 2 more bullets whizzed past her and shattered the car's left mirror, the girl screamed again, complaining, "I can't concentrate." The man hit his steering wheel. "Focus, or the black men will." The man couldn't finish his sentence as a red cloud of blood sprayed from his chest. The bullet that tore through his chest also exploded the front console of the car. The car swerved right, then quickly left, crashed into a Ford Fiesta, went airborne, did 2 somersaults in the air, and then fell to the asphalt. After rolling over 4 times, the Mercedes slowed to a stop about 50 meters behind the car that had stopped after hitting a transit minibus. The Golf looked like a crushed soda can. The blonde girl, whose right side of her face was split open, crawled out of the vehicle. Her white shirt was torn and covered in blood. Most of the blood was not her own. She could not feel her right leg. All she could do was crawl. When she looked, she saw that her left wrist was broken. She could not use her left hand. It did not hurt. It just throbbed regularly. The right side of her face was constantly burning. She did not even realize that she could see with her left eye. All she wanted was to get away. She was not a fanatic, which was why she had been chosen for this mission. She did not want to fall into the hands of the black men. The doors of the Mercedes opened. 4 men got out. All 4 were wearing black suits. They were not wearing ties, the collars of their white shirts were open. The driver looked around without moving away from the open door, his 4 or 5 fingers of brown hair combed to the left. His hand was waiting in his inner jacket pocket. The other man who got out of the front door was dark, big and tall. He had cut his hair quite short. He was quite ugly with his hard face and broken, blunt nose. The man was carrying an MP5 SD5 in his hand. The magazine was slightly curved between the butt and the forend of the gun. The gun was lying freely in his right hand. One of the men coming out from behind turned towards the back of the Mercedes, moved forward about 3 meters and started watching the back of the road. He had a silenced M4 carabine in his hand. The other man started advancing diagonally from the man in front of him. He also had an MP5 SD5 like the man in front. The man in front raised his gun and fired a few shots at the woman. Only the clicking sound of the gun was followed by the small ringing of the falling shells. The woman curled up as 2 bullets hit her waist and back. She was groaning where she was. She had pulled her knees up to her stomach. "The wizard bitch is out of her element," the man in front said with a smile. But the woman had not really fainted. She had only shaken off the shock of the incoming bullets. Although she could not see or hear properly due to the loss of blood, she had determined the location of her enemy by the voice of the man walking towards her. Raising her right hand shakily, she said, "Diler." The man in front saw the woman's hand rising towards him too late, and made a move to jump aside. However, the spell had caught him. The second man coming from behind saw the yellowish light coming out of the eyes, mouth and ears of his friend in front of him. The man in front unconsciously pulled the trigger of his extended MP5 SD5. Many holes opened up in the transit minibus with a wavy line. The man, whose mouth, nose and scorched eye sockets were smoking, spun around and collapsed to the ground. The man behind him was younger than him, but cautious. He knelt down and emptied his magazine into the woman, who was still looking for her other target with his eyes that did not see her. The woman, whose body was torn to pieces, disappeared before she could cast the spell she had prepared. The driver only looked at this situation with annoyance and roared at the young man who was getting up, "You idiot. You'll be lucky if Michael doesn't kill you for doing this." The man pointed at the woman with his thumb, trying to find something to say, and mumbled, "But..." The driver picked up his friend who was burning up inside and picked him up from the ground and growled, "Shut up. Take that bitch too. If you can't get the person out of the car, burn the car down." He had been in this business for a long time. He knew the police would come soon and things would get unnecessarily complicated. That's why he was planning to leave right away. After throwing him into the trunk of the Mercedes, he looked at the new man and said, "And you better think about how you're going to tell Michael that you killed the only clan member who can tell him how to find the twins." His expression showed that this situation was more serious than annoying. The young man swallowed involuntarily. The driver looked around once more. "Idiot. He said, shaking his head and getting into his car. London, England. We are the good guys. September 21st. Sean Hopestein was completely focused. Tall, lean, and athletic, he took a deep breath and plugged in his MP3 player. The bus had arrived at the stop and Guano Apes started playing as he darted out of the vehicle as the doors opened. He was wearing his usual, worn-out gray tracksuit. He started running west on Main Street, but he didn't slow down. He skidded to the right and scraped against the wall to avoid an elderly couple he encountered. He jumped up to the trash cans that were chest high in front of him, put his hands on them, pulled his legs up to his chest, and climbed over the trash cans. He had reached the corner of the street just past the trash cans. He slid across the front hood of a parked Ford Focus and continued running. He was completely absorbed in the beat of the music now. The supermarket owner, Mhir, was unloading Edgar's new products with a truck. So he had blocked the street on the left side of the sidewalk where Sean was. On his right, in front of the market window, was Mr. Matthews's assistant Brad's wheelbarrow. Sean would do a track just for these moments and would get off the bus 4 stops early. He quickly jumped onto the lower sill of the window and pushed himself off, reaching the back tire of the truck when Brad noticed him. The apprentice paused and cursed as Sean did a somersault in the air, passing over the apprentice and landing on the ground with a somersault. "It's getting better and better," Mr. Edgar said, grinning as he emerged from the shop. Edgar was a foot shorter than Sean, but the man was an Irishman who had been a bodybuilder for many years. Sean and his brother Ian Hopestein had met in a street fight when they first moved into the neighborhood. The two brothers had sided with Edgar against a street gang and saved him from a possible stabbing. The Irishman, who regularly shaved his head and wore a white shirt and a grocery apron, had never forgotten it. Edgar's apprentice, Brad, was a thin, red-haired boy of 5'4". He was pale with fear. He swallowed hard and muttered, "When you do this without frightening me to death, I'll really be dancing in the street." Edgar shook his head, motioning his apprentice to carry the goods inside, then watched the young man run away. His expression was somber. Denise Gabriel was a blonde, blue-eyed man, 5 feet 5 inches tall. His straight nose was hooked, giving him the air of a hawk. His blonde hair was freshly washed, shiny, and cut to his ears. His thick, furrowed eyebrows made his sharp features look even more irritable. The broad-shouldered, athletic young man wore gray trousers, black patent leather shoes, and a navy blue jacket. He wore a white shirt underneath. He was driving his black Mercedes 190D toward the suburbs west of London. Despite having been in England for a long time, he still hadn't gotten used to the traffic flowing in the opposite direction. Checking the message on his BlackBerry, the man in his late 20s signaled left and parked in the same alley where he had parked before. He didn't like this neighborhood at all. He had had problems before with the young boys of several gangs who were fighting heatedly over dominance in the neighborhood. However, The message that had come to his phone an hour ago was from an informant he couldn't ignore. The street was almost empty. Gabriel's only remaining footsteps were stopped by instinct. Most of the shadows that emerged from the front and back of the alley were 15 or 16 years old. The boy in front had nearly shaved his head. He held a metal bar in his hand. Others carried baseball bats and heavy clubs. He heard someone behind him carrying a chain. "I'm afraid you've taken the turnpike, mate," he said, laughing nonchalantly. Gabriel hadn't taken his eyes off the boy. But he knew there were 6 people behind him. He had been trained for this. There was only the boy with the iron bar and 3 others in front of him. British law strictly protected children under the age of 18, and this protective boundary provided immunity. In many places, these types of malicious children used the law as a shield to form youth gangs. Usually, these gangs would choose immigrants who would be thrown out of the border at their first mistake as victims. However, Gabriel had realized that the young people were overconfident after the empire of fear they had established on the immigrants in the region. Gabriel, whose expression did not change at all, slowly opened the left side of his jacket. "Fortunately, I have my pass with me," he said. The boy with the iron bar in his hand swallowed and saw the MP5K hanging in his underarm holster under his jacket. MP5Ks were submachine guns that the German Heckler & Koch company had started producing in 1964. The MP5s, which entered service in 1966, had become very popular due to their wide range of uses, many additional equipment for special operations, and different variations. The MP5s had single, double, triple and fully automatic fire modes. Gabriel was carrying the compact version of the gun, which used 9x19 and parabellum ammunition. The effective range of the MP5KS was 150 meters, and the kid, whose color and confidence had fled along with him, knew that if he pushed his luck, the man would kill him before he left this alley. He retreated to the side wall of the alley, his hands raised at shoulder level in surrender, and the other members of his gang followed him. "I don't want any scratches on my car," Gabriel said immediately after he passed them. "If anything happens to her, I'll find you." Gabriel did not like London and the suburb he was currently walking in. For the young man who had been transferred from Thailand a few years ago, it was really inactive. He walked for about 2 blocks without using the main streets and the big avenues, and when he reached a main street, he entered a narrow side street. The street, which was barely 5 feet wide, was at most 20 meters long. Reaching the fire exit at the end of the street, Gabriel took his mobile phone out of his jacket and called the person he had been texting. When the phone was answered, he simply said, "I'm here." A minute later, the fire exit opened and a sullen-faced man appeared. The owner of the only grocery store in the area was Mr. Edgar Simmons. Edgar looked at the windows of the 2 buildings that formed the side street with an air of unpredictability from his type. Then he handed the paperback folders in his hand to Gabriel. Gabriel opened the folders and looked at the photographs of the children inside. Sean Hopestein and Ian Hopestein. He continued to listen to the big Irishman as he memorized the names and faces. "As I said, I have great respect for your organization," said the Irishman. "Please give my regards to Mr. Solenson." Gabriel looked up from the files and said, "Of course, Mr. Simmons. First of all, I have just received information about the young men you are looking for," said Edgar Simmons, spreading his hands apologetically. Gabriel raised an eyebrow, not understanding what the big man meant when he said, "We've been looking for them for years." Then he concluded from what Edgar said that he had known these young men for a long time. "Yes, but the church messenger did not say that the twins were not alike," said Edgar, in protest. Gabriel shrugged. "It's okay, Mr. Simmons. Mishaps like that happen. Yes, the twins won't look alike. What about the other signs?" he asked. He wasn't enjoying playing the game of whose fault, and he didn't have much time. Simmons nodded. "Yes, sir. They don't look alike at all. Some of the other marks match. When I found out the wanted ones were twins, I looked them up. Everything I found on them is in the files." Gabriel held up the files in his hand and asked, "How did you get the files?" Edgar Simmons was a penitent, but his criminal record was not thin. Now he was a church member and ran a convenience store, but Gabriel would never rely on them. My daughter works at Wellington Hospital, Simmons sniffed. My daughter works at Wellington Hospital, he said reluctantly. Gabriel could tell the man didn't like talking about his daughter very much. While Edgar continued, it wasn't hard to get her files. And Fargus McGregor from our bar works at St. Paul's High School. I said I'd loan them to the boys and bought Fargus a half bottle of whiskey, so the files came to me right away, he said, almost growling. I understand. I'll copy the files and bring them back to you. It wouldn't be nice if they were missing, Gabriel said calmly, placing the files under his left armpit. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, Simmons said sincerely, scratching his head. And are these the kids you're looking for? He asked. Simmons, but we'll find out, Gabriel said, straightening his jacket and clasping his hands in front of him. Edgar Simmons suddenly frowned. The children won't get hurt, right? He asked with narrowed eyes. Not long ago, both of them had shown great courage and saved Edgar from a big problem. He really didn't want to get them into trouble. Gabriel, on the other hand, was tense at the sudden change of character of the big man in front of him. When he said coldly, "We, the church, have no interest in killing children, Mr. Simmons," Edgar pulled himself together and grumbled, "I meant no disrespect to the church." Gabriel said with an expression close to a smile, "It's not important. I understand your goodwill and concern, and it is a great sign of your penitent spirit. The Vatican is grateful for your attention and resourcefulness. After the information you have provided has been checked, the amount we agreed upon will be deposited into your account. I will also bring the originals." Simmons smiled sheepishly and shook Denise Gabriel's hand. "We're not the bad guys," she mumbled, checking the folders under her armpit again as she walked through the back door of the store to her car. She sent a text with her BlackBerry. The text was short and to the point. Meet up. D. Edinburgh, Scotland. Hunt. September 21st. Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland, was cold and rainy. The city was the second largest city in the country after Glasgow. The city, located in the east of Scotland and well north of London, was close to the North Sea. The city, dominated by grey and covered in clouds, was one of the most beautiful places in Europe. Edinburgh was known for its medieval and Georgian architecture. Built on rocks and in the historic city, there was a chase in one of the side streets leading to the city's main street, the Royal Mile, which the city was not usually used to. 3 young people slipped and entered the stone-covered street wet by the rain. When the third lost his balance where he slipped, he crawled a little and recovered with the support of his hands, which he wore fingerless gloves. He continued to run with all his strength, like the others. With the whizzing that came immediately afterwards, 3 bullet holes opened in the wall where he was a few seconds ago. However, no gunshot was heard. This increased the third's running speed visibly. All 3 of them were wearing wide side-pocketed pants, thick hooded sweatshirts and berets that allowed them to move comfortably. All 3 of them were wearing backpacks. The young man running in front was of African origin. The young man, who was close to 1.5 years old, was wearing a navy blue t-shirt, a black sweatshirt and dark gray pants. He was running with perfect balance in his running shoes. When he looked ahead, his frowning face turned from anxiety to pessimism. At the end of the street they entered, a 3-meter wall blocked the way. The young man, who climbed the trash can in front of the wall in one move, jumped onto the wall, pulled himself up quickly and climbed onto the wall. She really was as agile as a cat. As she leapt over the wall, she growled at her friends who were following her, "Hurry up, you fools." Her name was Kelly Hepson, and she worked as a pizza delivery man in Edinburgh by night and was trained by her master by day. Kelly looked at her friend Paul, who was some 5 meters behind her, and Lisa, who was running after him. She knew they were going to fail. It was a gift from God. Some things Kelly just knew. The person who came from the back of the group was Lisa McGraw. The 22-year-old young woman was 5 feet tall and had regular features. Her blonde hair was sticking out of a hood. She looked at Paul, who was advancing in front of her. The young man was 4 inches taller than her. He had already climbed up the wall and was straddling it like a horse. The tall, Dark-haired young man with a long face shouted anxiously, "Hurry up." Lisa jumped up and rose to the top of the trash can. But she was too late. The man who had turned the corner after the trio was carrying a silenced Beretta 92F. He fired the gun with such speed that it was hard to see. The bullet that came out of Lisa's forehead made it look like her forehead had exploded. Losing control, the girl suddenly slid down on her knees on top of the trash can, hitting her face against the wall and staying there. Pole reached down to pull Lisa up. As he watched the blood spraying from Lisa's forehead as if time had slowed down for a moment, he shouted, "No." Michael Richardson seized the moment and reached out desperately to Lisa, who was still lying on the ground, and fired 2 bullets at the screaming Pole. Pole raised his hand and conjured a protective spell. A shield of blue glass-like light immediately formed in front of his hand. But there was not enough time for the spell to be truly protective. Both bullets hit the incomplete energy shield, shattering it and tearing 2 holes the width of Pole's cheekbone and forehead, the width of his index finger. The young man tumbled back against the wall with a wet gurgle. Michael leapt at it without hesitation. But the third wizard had already moved away. It had not taken Michael long to find the Edinburgh safe house. There was a good team of former SAS commandos here. They had caught the wizard before he could even react. But the woman's 4 apprentices had attacked the team at the last moment, killing one of them. Michael had chased after the remaining 3 apprentices while the team took the wizard to the company's safe house for questioning. Richardson cursed between his teeth and heard the text alert on his phone. His eyebrows raised when he saw the words "meet me. D." His team had arrived, the dead had been removed immediately, and anything that might contain information had been collected. While Michael was waiting for the cleanup crews to leave, his phone rang. Answering the phone, Michael heard the bass baritone voice of his platoon sergeant major. "This is my boss, Brass," said the 40-year-old mercenary who normally didn't talk much. "Brass, what happened?" Michael asked, not taking his eyes off the road. Brass's voice was genuinely distressed, and he huffed, "The woman isn't talking, but I don't like her reactions." "What do you mean?" Michael had learned to trust Brass's instincts above all else. "When I asked about Yenazag, the woman laughed at me." Her tone was sincere, as if I didn't know about something as familiar as sunrise. "Meanwhile, the interrogators are on their way," she said in a grumbling tone. "The Inquisitors?" Michael asked, one eyebrow raised. The Inquisitors he meant were the priests of the Inquisition, trained in interrogation. They were truly brutal men, trained in torture and psychological pressure, and they were not easily sent out of Rome. Other operators, like Brass, didn't like these guys very much. Fighting the wizards, interrogating them, torturing them was one thing, and torture was another. "Yeah, they just said they were coming. You know I can't stop them," he complained, which was something Brass wouldn't normally do. Michael knew he had to go back, but he accepted that even that wouldn't save the situation. "I know, don't worry. Question the woman until they get here, whatever you can find out is worth it," he said as he walked towards his car. 2 hours later, as Denise Gabriel looked out over the city from the 20th floor of the Sky Tower, a plaza facing central London, she smiled when she saw Michael reflected in the thick glass in front of her. "It's been a long time," she said without turning around. Michael crossed the spacious, minimalist living room to the mahogany liquor cabinet. "Everyone's complaining about this lately," he grumbled as he poured himself a vodka. "You're a busy man," Denise said with a laugh. Michael let out a sarcastic breath and asked, "Look who said that, weren't you in Thailand?" "They transferred me to the European office," Denise shrugged. "Reward or punishment?" Michael asked, his eyes narrowing. He had a mischievous look on his face. Denise smiled, scratched her head, and said, "I think it's a reward." "How are you?" Michael asked, sitting down on the large couch in front of her, one arm across the back of the couch, and smiling. He hadn't seen Denise in almost 5 years. "Tired, are you?" Denise asked, one hand in her pocket. "Not bad," Michael said, taking a sip of vodka. "What happened in Russia?" Denise asked. There were many rumors in the office, but no one knew more than the rumors. "I guess our guys were a little overconfident, but I didn't look under the rug," Michael muttered. "Could it be treason?" Denise asked, one eyebrow raised. She understood what he meant by looking under the rug. Michael shrugged, putting his vodka on the coffee table. "Maybe, but no one wants to bet on a losing horse," he said. "What makes you think we won?" Denise asked, amused. Meanwhile, outside the apartment where they were talking, a shadow had waited for the two hunters to come in. After putting his ear to the door and waiting for them to talk and relax, he silently opened the door using his electronic card and snuck in. "You wouldn't be dressed so nicely if we were losing," Michael said, pointing to Denise's suit. Smiling, Denise picked up two cardboard files from the glass coffee table and handed them to Michael. Michael looked at the files and asked, "Are you sure?" "All the signs match," Denise said, pouring herself a whiskey from the liquor cabinet. "Why didn't you send it to Toscani?" Michael asked with a frown. "I wanted to check. I don't want to embarrass the first cardinal of the Vatican with a grocer's report," Denise said, but Michael could tell from his old friend's tone that this wasn't the whole truth. The shadow calmly removed the pins from his pocket and moved into a more comfortable position to throw them. "So you couldn't trust," Michael said. "Yes," said Denise wearily. When Michael felt the familiar tingle, he drew his weapon with the speed that had made him legendary. But this time, it was Kelly who was prepared. Kelly cast a simple spell of darkness, plunging the room into darkness while throwing two grenades inside, the pins of which she pulled. Kelly had been following Michael since Edinburgh. He had been helped in this by a man in a white suit and a Panama hat who found him in the park where he was hiding. The old man, who said he was an old wizard, gave Kelly two important things that would help him avenge his friends and master: a Ford Focus and a Bond bag inside. Inside the Bond bag were 4 hand grenades, a Colt 1911, a fake ID belonging to LGG, an electronic key and about €10,000. When he heard the 2 grenades hit the ground, Michael did the only thing he could do and threw himself to the side. The shock of the explosion threw him back to the side he had jumped from before he could even reach the ground. He had left the area of effect of the magical darkness, but he had partially lost consciousness from the shock of being slammed into the hard ground. At the same time, the couch he had been sitting on earlier had fallen on his chest, pinning him to the floor. Kelly calmly entered the room. The explosion had set the seats ablaze. The outside windows had been blown out, and the harsh wind was blowing the curtains and the flames. The young man came to Denise and looked at her lifeless body. Next to her were half-burned files. Kelly knelt down, picked up the Hopestein's files, and put them in the inside pocket of his jacket. The explosion had thrown Michael backwards, and he managed to control himself before everything went black. But a door had fallen on him. As he tried to throw it aside, cursing, the weight of the door suddenly increased. Michael's eyes narrowed as he saw Kelly, a Colt 1911 in his hand, above the door. Kelly was shouting angrily, "I know the new age, you bastards. We're not going to let you destroy the world, do you understand?" And he fired the gun in his hand. Michael was shaken by the heavy blows to his torso. Kelly had fired 7 shots into the door and into Michael's chest behind it. Taking one last look at the unconscious man behind the door, he took advantage of the chaos in the corridors and exited the hotel. In the chaos caused by the fire alarm, no one had even noticed him. A few minutes later, Michael came back, taking a deep breath and putting his hand on his chest. His Kevlar protective vest and the door had prevented the .45 from tearing him apart. However, a few of his ribs must have been broken. Cursing under his breath, he threw the door aside and tried to get up. On his first try, he fell to the side, screaming in pain. His ribs were indeed broken. He frowned as the curtains flew in the strong wind. He went to where Denise was lying, but his friend's face and body had been torn apart by the grenades. Unable to bear this sight, he turned his head to the side. He looked for Denise's files, but couldn't find them. He knew he didn't have much time. He left the building before the police arrived. Before he fainted from the pain, he found a general telephone and dialed the number he had memorized again. The phone, which had been ringing for a while, was answered by Toscani, his voice uncharacteristically anxious. Michael could hear the fire and security alarms going off in the background, the Vatican Guard's orders and commands. "Who are you?" Toscani shouted. "Cardinal Toscani, what are you doing on that phone?" Michael asked with narrowed eyes. "Is that you, Michael?" the Cardinal asked in a concerned tone. "Yes," Michael said through clenched teeth and a face contorted by his aching ribs. Toscani sounded genuinely concerned. "Just in time, Pope Octavius has been attacked. You must come here immediately," he said urgently. "I'm afraid I can't. I need medical attention," Michael muttered, leaning back against the wall because of his spinning head. "What happened? Where are you?" Toscani asked curiously. "London. I met with Denise Gabriel, but we were raided." "Denise was killed," Michael said, struggling to speak. "Ah yes, Octavius Papa said you were going to Edinburgh." "Then get your treatment and go to Serbia," Toscani said coldly, apparently suppressing his panic and starting to think rationally. "Serbia?" Michael asked curiously. "Yes, Viktor Polanov is the leader of those who did this. We caught 2 of his men in Rome, but we couldn't stop them," Toscani said coldly. "I understand, sir," Michael said, pulling himself together. Toscani's voice had not changed, but Michael could detect subtle differences in tone. The man was genuinely worried. "For God's sake, hurry up, Michael. Whatever is happening, it's serious." As Michael walked away to have his wounds tended to, the fire department and ambulances had just arrived at the building. Things were worse than serious. He had lost the file on the twins, Denise and the Pope had been killed. Even the Russian raid had been a sign that things were about to change, but no one had paid attention to this bloody sign. As Michael walked away, he pushed the twins of fate into the dark corners of his mind. Now was the time for revenge. London, England. Do you know? September 23rd. Ian shook his head and looked at the smoke rising from the burning incense. In fact, incense helps focus, directs motivation towards the scent, and prevents the nose from being distracted by any scent. I still hate incense. The high-ceilinged study area of the martial arts hall was filled with a distinct smell of incense. The hall was dominated by white and gray colors. This whiteness gave a deceptive sense of spaciousness. The walls were covered with gray, hardened sponge-filled fabric protectors up to 1.5 meters high. The floors were covered with light-colored wood. The rhythmic drum sounds came from the hidden sound system, 7778. Shit. What came next? I can't remember, said the middle-aged man. The deep-voiced man's speech had a distinctly Western accent. Military discipline was evident in every aspect. The entire hall had accepted the teachings and discipline he imparted, and the entire hall shouted as if to show this. 1. Do you know what push-ups are? 2. Discipline. Fly. Self-confidence. 4. Pride. 5. Durability. 6. At a school that aims to teach a Far Eastern martial art, you can learn all of these if the one who shows the way understands the meaning of the path. Smiling and looking at the tired body of the student he had dealt with in his broken English, he said, "Start again." The student paused, sighed, and started doing push-ups again. The Frenchman, kneeling over Ian, asked mockingly, "What happened, are you upset?" Ian replied, "No. Sir." On his right, Sean was watching Ian while doing push-ups. When the Frenchman noticed this, he started looking at Sean and the young man immediately turned to face him. Ian's muscles were burning, his arms were shaking. He was almost fainting from exhaustion, but he would die rather than show it to the Frenchman. This wasn't hatred. It had nothing to do with trying to gain respect. It was part of an unspoken, unwritten agreement. Maybe they would faint from exhaustion, and the man who always pushed their bodies one step beyond the point of exhaustion wouldn't force them, wouldn't shout at them, and yet no student in the hall would stop. I think it was more important to them not to disappoint him. The Frenchman was a NATO officer. He had opened this hall to teach what he knew, and many NATO officers and their acquaintances soon filled the hall as much as the British. Although the events that had once happened between their countries still seemed to some students as a convenient excuse to create problems, the occasional sparks that did arise were quickly extinguished by the Frenchmen. To the Frenchmen, they were no longer strangers. They were one with their blood and sweat, they would be one person, one soul. Ian and Sean were not the best in that class, but they were the best of their time. They were not bright students. The French had seen bright students before. Ian and Sean were not like this. However, despite their low level of talent, they performed above the others. Their shortcomings were made up for by their endurance, unchangeable basic morality, and their success in mental exercises. The two brothers would regularly come to the gym during their free time and work for hours. In a few months, they'll be ready for the black belt exam, the Frenchman thought. As he thought about this, he continued to count. 45. 46, he said calmly. Ian shook his head and muttered, 46. He sank back into his reverie. At that time, he would focus more on the smell of incense than on the numbers his teacher was counting. He would feel every bundle of his muscles, because each one would constantly send pain signals to his brain in the boundlessness of the strain. The smell of incense and the same mental exercise. Pain is an illusion. Illusions cannot prevent you. I hate incense. The silver Ford sped through the old, winding streets of the suburbs. The driver found the address he was looking for in a few tries, but still couldn't avoid being late. So he parked in the first place he found. The curly-haired businessman got out with quick and sharp movements. They had turned the entrance of an old apartment building next to one of the old-fashioned houses in the suburbs, which can now be counted on the fingers, into a dojo. The Frenchman's house was on the second floor. He had met Gerard in a course he had taken in high school, and they had been pen pals for a long time. Unfortunately, when this adventurous Frenchman came to London on a NATO mission, the man was at his busiest. When they met a few years later, the Frenchman told him that his sons would be taking their black belt exams at his dojo next week. Gerard Dumar had an international reputation as an educator. His short, neatly cut hair perfectly matched his angular, wide jaw, always clean-shaven face, and made his steely blue eyes even sharper. His movements were as graceful as a cat, but only someone who knew how to look could tell how deadly the Frenchman could be. Thanks to his position and reputation in NATO, he had easily opened this educational institution that fully implemented the Far Eastern philosophy. The large hall at the entrance of the three-story house that had been converted into a dojo was quite different from other gyms in both style and style. The entire area, covered with wood, was kept as simple as possible and was kept free of humidity. On the upper floor, the Frenchman was sitting with his daughter, whom he considered his only asset in life. The man glanced around briefly, passing the other families waiting at the dojo's door one by one. His anger was evident in his gray eyes. For this reason, no one wanted to stand in front of the curly-haired man. When Sean nodded, Ian in the crowded locker room felt himself shaking with excitement. His father had indeed come. They had come for the black belt and Dan exams, even though he had kept it a secret from him. Ian had always suspected that it was the grumpy Frenchman who had said this, but he could never prove it. He had neither been afraid nor excited until he saw his family before the exam. Their secrets, which they had kept for years, had come out. Even now, he wondered if they had known all along. When you start that familiar game with the javelins, your eyes and brain are slow next to your hands. You are faster than anything. Thoughts always lag behind, and you see your hands, which are swollen from the blows during the match, and you have difficulty moving them, and you feel the pain. Faster than your nerves. Not only your hands, but your whole body has failed. That's when you smell that smell again, you get out of the smell of blood and sweat, and you scratch your nose. At same time. Incense. The middle-aged man had just sat down when the students slowly greeted the hall. He recognized his sons from behind the heavy metal railing mask. Who else's eyes would widen when they saw him? How had they managed to hide this from him for 4 years? Or how had he not been able to see the changes in his sons? Although he hadn't been able to get up from work for a long time, and when he came home from work he would argue with his wife. Yes, he thought. We had drifted apart a lot. But it was a serious situation to come to this point. He was brought out of his thoughts by the crashing of the boards against each other at machine gun speed. He tightened his coat in his arms and his chest tightened, but the boy knew what he was doing, for the first time. Sean was standing on the sidelines while Ian was on the track. His face was expressionless. While his brother was fighting with all his talent, he was looking at his father with the blood drained from his face. He swallowed, thinking about what would happen at home, no matter what happened on the track called Tatamai. If it hadn't been for the chance encounter with the Frenchman, he would never have seen or known it, and the bruises would have been just a bicycle accident. His clenched, white fists loosened. He let his coat go. Yes, he did, thought the Frenchman. The boy Ian was the son of a friend they had met at a camp many years ago, and he was beating the hell out of a man twice his size. His strategy was perfect, the man was big and bulky, not a child. He had developed this strategy by fighting with his brother, who was as agile as he was. The man relied on his muscle strength, but the boy had worked many times harder than the man. The man was a fool, and he barely noticed it. The more he tried to strike, the slower he got, and the young man, who was spinning around his slowing spear, would beat the man up with light blows over and over again. It was a vicious cycle. The man, who was getting madder as he was hit, was getting madder, and this was breaking his guard even more. Victory was inevitable for the boy. When he realized this, it was too late for the man. There was nothing he could do when the man collapsed to the ground. Ian, smiling, took off his helmet, remembered that his father was sitting in the spectator rows behind him, and swallowed just like his brother. They had been caught. But neither their father nor the children could see Otto, who was watching them with silent anger, and Otto noticed Gail Portman following him. Gail wondered why Otto had come to watch these games. Was this where the sorority found their new members, their rookies? Then she realized that Otto had kept an eye on the two brothers. At that moment, she heard one of the two girls sitting next to her say, "You know, they're twins," the blonde said. "What? They don't look alike at all." "Yes, they are identical twins." Gail's eyebrows rose in surprise as she looked at Otto again. New chapter. Nexco. September 28, New York, USA. The quietest of the oil moguls and the one who remained hidden from the media was James Bakesfield. Bakesfield, who founded the Nexco conglomerate, sat at his mahogany desk in his usual navy blue, hand-tailored suit, waiting for the video connection to be established. He was in his 60s, and the power of the old man who had always been careful about his weight was felt at first glance. His face, always serious and inscrutable, had angular, hard features. His small eyes, which were on his face, looked behind his high cheekbones with a sparkle rarely seen in his peers. His white, nape-length hair was carefully combed back. Most of his employees, unlike now, knew Bakesfield's affectionate and warm gaze. However, his employees knew very little about Bakesfield. When the video connection was established, he looked at the man in front of him with furrowed brows. When Otto greeted him with a smile, Bakesfield asked in his usual cold British accent, "Are you sure about this?" "How can you be sure of a prediction, a prophecy?" "Everything the fortune teller predicted has come true," the old man said. The lines on his face from difficult times deepened as the man smiled, making the first thoughts about his age disappear in doubt. Bakesfield raised his head slightly, raising one eyebrow. "Keep guarding the gate. Since the prophecy is coming true, the first traveler of the gate to be opened has already been chosen. Find him and help him go. This has been expected for centuries. Now the time has become even more important. Our numbers are diminishing, the gate must be opened before we become extinct or the black men realize who we are," he said. Otto von Lonsenrader had known Bakesfield for a long time. They had experienced many adventures together, shared many sorrows, tasted many victories. Bakesfield clenched his jaw, allowing his emotions to show for the first time in many years. "I will guard the gate with every fiber of my soul." "It has been a pleasure to serve you," he said with an uncharacteristically fanatic tone. "The pleasure is mine," Otto said with a rueful smile, tipped his hat to Bakesfield, and then ended the video call. When the image disappeared, the man in the Panama hat smiled as he thought about the secret he had kept to himself. He had been watching for a long time who would open the door. Bakesfield, on the other hand, was looking at the reports prepared in front of him. He looked at the name at the top of these reports from London. Ian. Shaking his head, he whispered, "The time has come." October 2nd, England, London, Reekmount. Reekmount was a quiet suburb in the west of London. It wasn't as glamorous or wealthy as the centre. The Hopestein family lived in this neighborhood now. Neither Sean nor Ian complained about it. They had had a lot of immigrants in the past few years, but Sean thought they had made the neighborhood even more colorful and lively. It was 2 years after they had received their black belts. The punishment they received after that exam was terrible. They were forbidden from going out for 6 months. But their father still allowed them to go to Gerard's dojo. Sean and Ian had always wondered if the French had something to do with it. Sean was running parkour as usual. When he entered his street, he noticed something different. The suburb he lived in was made up of rows of classic English houses. The stone-walled houses had white moldings, brown wooden doors, and stairs leading to them. Some of the walls were covered with ivy. As Sean approached his house, he saw a Bentley waiting in front of his house and a chauffeur in a suit standing at the door. As he approached his house, he saw his neighbor Albert Huxley sitting diagonally across from him. The tall red-haired young man was sitting on the stairs with the Jamaicans at the end of the block. When he saw Sean, he raised his hand in greeting and shouted, "Hey Hopestein, I didn't know you were rich." Sean didn't understand what he meant. So he said, "Me too." With laughter coming from the other side, Sean exchanged glances with the tall, broad-shouldered, short-haired, and sunglasses-wearing man waiting at the Bentley's door and entered his house as usual. The man had a white fedora on his knee. He was wearing a white suit and shoes like his hat. His legs were crossed. He had thick, night rings in his hands, which were placed on the sides of the chair. His white hair was cut bluntly and combed back. He had a broad face, a skull that was almost perfect. His face full of wrinkles looked angular and strong. He had a straight, arched nose, his eyes were a lively, dark blue color, different from the tired eyes of old people. The man looked very calm, unlike his mother. There was a walking stick leaning on the chair next to the old man. The stick was thin and black, unlike the old man's clothes. The first thing Sean noticed other than these was his mother's nervousness. The brunette, thin and tall woman, who was sitting upright, had her hands clasped on her legs, which she held together. When he saw Sean entering, he stood up and said, "Welcome dear, Sean, this is Mr. Otto." While the old man in the white suit got up from his seat, put his Panama hat on the seat and extended his hand to shake his hand and said, "Otto von Lonsenrader. Sean, I am your uncle." The man looked to be in his late 60s. Still, Sean thought the man's eyes sparkled with a different youth. The young man glanced briefly at his mother, who was looking at the old man with wide eyes, shook the outstretched hand in a reserved manner, and then raised an eyebrow and asked, "How does someone with the last name von Lonsenrader become my uncle?" His voice was cold and distant. Otto secretly appreciated this. Sighing, Otto smiled warmly and said, "After your father and grandfather had some disagreements, your father changed his surname and address. That's why it took me a while to find you." Sean nodded and said, "I understand," although he didn't believe a word the man said. Otto was leaving too, Sean, Victoria Hopestein said, rising hastily. "Yeah," Otto said, smiling and glancing briefly at Victoria. "I was just leaving." "Nice to meet you, son," he said, taking his hat and walking stick and shaking Sean's hand again. Then, he asked, hesitantly, "Where's Ian?" "He's training as usual," Sean said with a shrug. Sean's eyes narrowed as Otto put on his hat and headed towards the front door. He was curious about what the old man knew about them. "Yes, I heard you were skilled with a sword." Gail Portman checked her watch as she photographed Otto's exit from the back of an old doubleau. She had continued to follow Otto von Lonsenrader after sending Catherine to Denise Gabriel's team to keep her out of it. She wasn't doing it to get into trouble, or for any medals. She had simply trusted Catherine's instincts. There was something big going on, something wrong with this, and Gail was curious about what it was. Then everything got even stranger. This time Gail had listened to her own instincts and stayed home instead of following Otto. A few hours later the other brother arrived. The boy was acting very strangely, as if he was drunk. Gail had regretted not having found the time to set up a listener or a camera set in the house at that time. Gail got ready after midnight, when all the lights on the street were going out one by one. She could break into the house like a thief tonight and set up listeners. But when she saw the slightest movement at the top of the street she paused. Otto's Bentley had returned. Gail followed him nervously. When most of the street was fast asleep, a black, long-body Bentley slowly turned from the west wing of the street that connected it to the main street. Its license plate bore the name of a private company. Its lights were off, it was moving at almost walking pace, making almost no noise. There were only 3 vehicles of its make and class that were so well armored and well made. 2 of them belonged to the President of the United States. The vehicle stopped calmly in front of the house where Ian had been sleeping just a few minutes before. The rear door, which normally had to be opened immediately by the guard sitting in the front, opened from the inside with a calm and slow movement. The thick, heavy door slid open silently in a sideways arc, and an old man dressed in black, unlike his usual clothes, stepped out. The tall, thin man calmly made a regular arc as he looked at the surrounding buildings one by one. He was wearing his usual linen suit, but this time he had chosen black for a change. It was the first time Gail had seen him wearing black, and he slowly lifted the camera from his lap. The old man's thick coat, appropriate for a cold October evening, was swaying in the breeze. He adjusted his black Panama hat and leaned on his black cane. The man appeared to be in his late 60s, yet his eyes, hidden under the hat, sparkled with a distinct youthfulness. As he tossed the mixed material he took out of his coat pocket into the air, the breeze around him slowly began to increase. The things being blown away looked more like letters drawn in squiggles on tree leaves. However, a careful eye could easily see that they were meticulously prepared and carefully stacked before being blown away. Most of the leaves were caught in the current of the wind circling around them before they got too far from their owners, caught fire on their own as they circled, and instantly turned into ashes with red-orange flames. The words he spoke at a tempo were beyond all known rules of language in the world. The signs he drew in the air with words spoken from his throat increased the wind around him, and as the wind increased, his coat flew up. The second group of materials he took out of his pocket was different from the others, made of the dust of precious metals, minerals, and crystals. As he tossed them, his voice coming from his throat became more raspy. With the words he spoke, the orange street lights illuminating the street were also dimming one by one, almost going out. When Gail Portman saw the lights coming from the Hopestein's second floor, she dropped her camera and drew her gun. She knew more or less what was happening, and she had to stop it. As she hurried out of her car, someone yanked her back by the collar, and Gail was shocked by a wave of pain that shot through her back. As she stared in surprise at the tip of the long, curved knife protruding from her chest, a middle-aged man's voice said in her ear, "It's too late now." Gail fell into the darkness before she even realized the gun had slipped from her hand. Before Otto von Lonsenrader got into his Bentley, his chauffeur walked towards him, wiping his long Yemeni dagger with a cloth. The old man smiled at the chauffeur who nodded to him and said, "The door can be opened now." After Otto von Lonsenrader left, the cleaning crew that arrived would drop Gail Portman off in a back street in North London and make it look like a robbery. Ian Hopestein, who disappeared that night, would not be found until some 20 years later. But these are the stories of another legend. End of the first chapter. See you in the second chapter.